The people who change your life rarely arrive when you are looking for them. Most of the time they appear on an ordinary day when you are too busy worrying about something else. At least that is how it happened to me. My name is Emma Collins. I was 27 years old, working long shifts as a nursing assistant at a community hospital in Manhattan, and trying to convince myself that being tired all the time was normal. On the afternoon everything began. Rain was falling steadily across the city. Not a storm. Just the kind of cold autumn rain that makes everyone walk a little faster and keep their heads down. I should have been heading home. Instead, I was sitting alone on a metal bench outside a blood donation center, pressing a small bandage against my arm and waiting for the dizziness to pass. Earlier that morning, the hospital had received an urgent request. A patient needed blood immediately. I did not know the person's name. I never asked. The nurses simply explained that every donation mattered. So I stayed after my shift and volunteered. By the time everything was finished, I felt exhausted. My stomach was empty. My head felt light. But when one of the staff members thanked me and quietly mentioned that the donation would help save a life, I knew I would make the same choice again. I leaned back against the bench and watched people hurry through the rain. Nobody noticed me. That was fine. I was used to it. Most of my life happened that way. I worked. I helped people. I went home. Then I did it all again the next day. Across the street, traffic slowed near the curb. A black luxury vehicle stopped at a red light. I never looked in its direction. If I had, I would have noticed a man sitting in the back seat watching the entrance of the donation center. Adrian Romano had spent most of his life surrounded by wealth, influence, and responsibility. That afternoon, he was returning from a business meeting that had lasted far too long. His attention had drifted toward the window when he noticed a young woman leaving the donation center alone. He watched as I sat on the bench. He watched the nurse come outside and offer assistance. He watched me smile politely and insist that I was fine. Then he watched something that stayed with him. An elderly woman carrying grocery bags slipped slightly on the wet sidewalk nearby. Before anyone else reacted, I stood up despite my own dizziness and hurried over to help her. Together we gathered the bags. Together we made sure she was steady. Only then did I return to the bench. The traffic light changed. The vehicle could have driven away. Instead, Adrian continued watching through the rain-speckled glass. Something about the scene refused to leave his mind. Not because it was dramatic. Not because anyone applauded. Quite the opposite. Nobody seemed to notice it at all. Back on the bench, I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the distant sounds of Manhattan. Sirens, car horns, footsteps, life moving forward. I had no idea that a stranger across the street had just become curious about me. I had no idea that one ordinary afternoon was quietly changing direction. To me, it was just another long day. To Adrian Romano, it was the first time in years that someone had captured his attention without asking for it. And neither of us knew that this rainy afternoon outside a blood donation center would become the beginning of everything. Some people leave an impression because of what they achieve. Others leave one because of who they are when nobody is watching. The morning after the rain, I woke up before sunrise and immediately regretted it. My arm still felt slightly sore from the donation, and my body reminded me that I had worked too many hours without enough rest. Unfortunately, the hospital schedule did not care how tired I felt. By 6:30, I was already walking through the employee entrance carrying a paper cup of coffee and trying to convince myself that caffeine could solve anything. The emergency department was unusually busy that day. Patients filled waiting rooms.
Phones rang constantly.
Nurses moved quickly between stations. Everyone seemed to need something at the same time. I spent most of the morning helping patients complete paperwork, transporting supplies, and making sure families received updates whenever possible. It was exhausting. It was chaotic. It was exactly why I loved my job. During lunch, I sat with a few coworkers in a small break room. Most conversations focused on bills, schedules, and weekend plans. Mine usually did too. Yet somehow I always found myself listening more than talking. That afternoon, one of the hospital volunteers approached me. Her name was Margaret. She was nearly 70 years old and spent her retirement helping patients navigate difficult situations. "Emma," she said softly, "thank you for helping Mr. Henderson yesterday." I looked confused. What happened? Margaret smiled. His family wanted me to tell you. He finally received the medication assistance approval he needed. That surprised me. For weeks I had been helping them complete applications and paperwork. I never expected to hear the outcome. That is wonderful, I said. Margaret nodded. They wanted you to know you made a difference. The conversation stayed with me for the rest of the day. Not because I needed recognition. I did not. But sometimes it was comforting to know that small efforts actually mattered. Across Manhattan, Adrian Romano sat in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Around him, executives discussed investments, acquisitions, and quarterly projections worth millions of dollars. Adrian listened politely, yet part of his attention remained elsewhere. The image of a young woman sitting outside the donation center kept returning unexpectedly. Eventually, after the meeting ended, he asked a trusted associate a simple question. Who is she? The associate looked confused. Adrian slid a photograph across the table. It had been captured by a security camera near the donation center entrance. Find out, Adrian said. The request was unusual. Adrian rarely showed personal interest in strangers. Yet something about Emma Collins refused to leave his thoughts. 2 days later, information arrived. 27 years old. Nursing assistant.
No scandals. No unusual connections. No hidden agenda.
The report should have ended there. Instead, it included something else. Volunteer work. Community outreach programs. Multiple blood donations over several years. Financial records showing modest income. Despite significant charitable contributions, Adrian read every page twice. Then a third time. Most people with limited resources focused entirely on survival. Emma somehow found ways to help others anyway. That evening, I left the hospital carrying groceries for my aunt, who was recovering from a long illness. The elevator in her apartment building was broken again. I climbed 4 flights of stairs while balancing shopping bags and silently negotiating with gravity. By the time I reached her door, I was laughing at how ridiculous everything felt. Life was not easy. It never had been. Yet somehow I still believed tomorrow could be better than today. And somewhere else in Manhattan, a man who possessed nearly everything money could buy was beginning to wonder why a woman with so little seemed happier than most people he knew. Kindness has a price that rarely appears on a receipt. Most of the time, it arrives quietly in the form of exhaustion, sacrifice, and choices nobody else sees. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and increasingly difficult. I worked long shifts at the hospital. I cared for my aunt after work. I paid bills. I stretched every dollar as far as it could go. Some mornings began before sunrise. Some evenings ended long after dark. Yet somehow there never seemed to be enough time or enough money. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat at a small kitchen table reviewing expenses while my aunt rested in the next room. Prescription costs had increased again. Utility bills were higher than expected. A repair was needed on her aging apartment building. I stared at the numbers and quietly calculated what could wait and what could not. The answer was simple. Almost everything would have to wait. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital carrying the same smile I wore every day. Patients did not need my worries. They already had enough of their own. By lunchtime, I was helping an elderly patient complete paperwork for financial assistance. Later, I spent nearly an hour locating resources for a family struggling with transportation costs. None of it appeared in my job description. I did it anyway. That evening after finishing another long shift, I stopped by the hospital cafeteria. A young nurse sat alone near the window looking upset. I recognized her immediately. She was new. During orientation week, she had seemed confident and energetic. Now she looked overwhelmed. I carried my tray to her table. Everything okay? I asked. She laughed softly. Honestly? Not really. For the next 20 minutes she talked while I listened. By the end of the conversation she looked noticeably better. Before leaving she smiled. Thank you. I smiled back. Someone did the same thing for me once. Across the city, Adrian Romano continued receiving occasional updates. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just small observations. Emma helping a patient. Emma volunteering extra hours. Emma delivering groceries to a neighbor. Emma donating blood again. The reports confused him. Not because they were suspicious, because they were consistent. Most people behaved differently when nobody was watching. Emma did not. One evening, Adrian sat alone in his office reviewing another report. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled beneath thousands of lights. His associate entered quietly. "Anything unusual?" Adrian asked. The associate shook his head. "Not unusual. Just Emma being Emma." Adrian looked down at the file. Several pages documented community programs she supported despite having limited financial resources herself. One line caught his attention. She had recently postponed replacing her own car because she contributed money toward a medical assistance fund for a patient's family. Adrian leaned back slowly. For several moments he said nothing. Finally he closed the file. Most people with her income would protect themselves first. His associate nodded. "She does not seem to think that way." After the office emptied, Adrian remained alone overlooking the city. He had built an empire by understanding people, their motives, their ambitions, their weaknesses. Yet Emma Collins remained difficult to explain. She expected nothing. She asked for nothing. She simply kept giving. Meanwhile, I stood on my apartment balcony later that same night watching traffic move through the streets below. The city felt endless, beautiful, exhausting. I had no idea someone was trying to understand me. I only knew that tomorrow would bring another early morning, another long shift, and another chance to help someone who needed it. What I did not realize was that my quiet acts of kindness were no longer going unnoticed. And somewhere beyond the lights of Manhattan, a powerful man was beginning to wonder if meeting me was no longer a coincidence at all. Sometimes the people who protect us never introduce themselves. They simply remove obstacles from our path and disappear before we realize they were there. The changes began so gradually that I almost missed them. At first, it was a phone call from a charitable foundation, informing the hospital that additional funding had been approved for several patient assistance programs. Everyone celebrated. Budgets had been tight for months. Resources were stretched thin. The extra support arrived exactly when it was needed most. A week later, one of the families I had been helping received approval for specialized treatment that had previously seemed impossible to afford. Then another patient received transportation assistance. Then another received access to medication support. Every few days more good news appeared. The hospital staff welcomed it. Patients welcomed it. I welcomed it too. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something unusual was happening. One afternoon, I sat with Margaret in the volunteer office reviewing paperwork. She adjusted her glasses and smiled as she looked through another approval notice. "It is remarkable," she said. "I have not seen this much support arrive all at once in years." I nodded. "It almost feels too good to be true." Margaret laughed softly. "Do not question miracles, Emma. Just enjoy them." I smiled, but curiosity lingered. That evening after work, I stopped by a small grocery store near my aunt's apartment. While standing in line, I received a call from her physician. My heart immediately tightened. Calls from doctors rarely arrived at convenient moments. To my surprise, the news was positive. A treatment option that had previously been unavailable had suddenly become accessible through a newly funded program. I leaned against a nearby shelf in complete disbelief. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Completely serious," the physician replied. "Someone made a significant contribution to the program." After the call ended, I stood there for several seconds staring at nothing. For the first time in months, genuine hope felt possible. Across the city, Adrian Romano sat in a private conference room reviewing community investment reports. Several initiatives had recently received funding through organizations connected to Romano Group. Officially, everything appeared routine. Unofficially, Adrian had personally approved many of the decisions. His associates noticed the pattern almost immediately. One evening, David, one of his most trusted executives, finally asked the obvious question. "This is about Emma Collins, is it not?" Adrian looked up from the documents. "Partially." David smiled knowingly. "You have never reviewed charitable distributions this closely before." Adrian considered the observation. It was true. Yet something about Emma continued to challenge his understanding of the world. Most people measured success by what they accumulated. She seemed to measure it by what she gave away. Later that night, Adrian reviewed another report. This one included a photograph from a hospital fundraising event. Emma stood among volunteers arranging supplies for patients. She looked tired. She also looked happy. Adrian studied the image longer than he intended. There was no performance in her smile. No audience. No expectation of reward. Just genuine satisfaction from helping others. Meanwhile, I sat beside my aunt in her apartment as she watched an old movie she loved. The room felt warmer than usual. Lighter somehow. For the first time in a long while, neither of us talked about bills or medical expenses. We simply enjoyed the evening. I had no idea that many of the blessings entering our lives shared a common source. I only knew that circumstances were improving. And somewhere beyond the city lights, a man who had built his life on power and influence was discovering that helping one extraordinary woman brought him a kind of satisfaction he had never expected. The first conversation is rarely the one people remember. It is the feeling afterward that stays with them. Nearly 2 months had passed since the rainy afternoon outside the donation center. Winter had begun settling over Manhattan. The air felt colder. The days felt shorter. Yet somehow life seemed lighter than it had before. Many of the programs helping patients at the hospital continued receiving support. My aunt's treatment was progressing better than expected. For the first time in a long while, I was allowing myself to believe that good things could happen without being followed immediately by bad ones. One Friday evening after an especially demanding shift, I stopped at a small coffee shop near the hospital. It was one of my favorite places in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just warm lighting, comfortable chairs, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the room. I ordered a drink and searched for an empty table. Every seat seemed occupied. Almost every seat. Near the window, one chair remained open across from a man reading documents on a tablet. He looked up as I approached. "Would you mind if I sat here?" I asked. The man smiled politely. "Not at all." I sat down and immediately focused on my coffee. The last thing I wanted after a long shift was awkward small talk. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then a sudden burst of wind rattled the windows. I glanced outside. Snow had started falling. "Looks like winter finally arrived," the man said. His voice was calm and surprisingly familiar. I smiled. New York always waits until the last possible moment. He laughed softly. "That is true. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, it continued. We talked about the weather. Then the city. Then work." His name was Adrian. He explained that he spent most of his time managing various business interests. The answer sounded intentionally vague, but I did not press for details. Something about him felt different from the people I usually met. He listened carefully. He never interrupted. He seemed genuinely interested in every answer. At one point he asked about my work at the hospital. I expected the conversation to shift quickly afterward. Most people lost interest once medical paperwork and patient assistance programs entered the discussion. Adrian did not. "That sounds important," he said. I shrugged. "It feels important to me." "Then it probably is." The answer surprised me. We talked for nearly an hour. The snow continued falling outside. Customers came and went. Somehow neither of us seemed eager to leave. There was an unusual ease between us. No pressure. No performance. Just conversation. Eventually I checked the time and nearly laughed. "I should go." Adrian glanced toward the window. "You probably should." Neither of us stood immediately. For a brief moment silence settled between us. Comfortable silence. The kind that feels rare. Finally I gathered my coat. "It was nice meeting you." His expression softened slightly. "The feeling is mutual." As I headed toward the door, I turned back one last time. Adrian was still watching the snowfall beyond the window. For some reason I smiled. He smiled back. Outside, the cold air hit my face immediately. I walked toward the subway station feeling unexpectedly lighter. I did not know why. It had only been a conversation. Nothing more. Yet something told me this would not be the last time our paths crossed. Inside the coffee shop, Adrian remained seated for several moments after I left. For the first time since noticing a young woman on a bench outside a donation center, he no longer had to rely on reports or observations. He had finally heard her voice. And somehow, hearing her speak had only deepened the curiosity he thought he understood. The more time you spend with someone, the harder it becomes to ignore the questions you cannot answer. After our first conversation at the coffee shop, seeing Adrian again should have felt unlikely. Manhattan was too large. Life was too busy. Yet somehow our paths continued crossing. Sometimes it happened at the same coffee shop near the hospital. Other times it happened during brief walks after work when the city lights reflected across winter streets. The meetings never felt planned, at least not from my perspective. They simply happened. And with each conversation, I learned a little more about the man who seemed determined to remain a mystery. Adrian spoke comfortably about books, travel, architecture, and business. He listened even better than he spoke. What he rarely discussed was himself. Whenever conversations drifted toward his personal life, his answers became shorter, more careful. It was not dishonesty, felt more like protection. One evening in late January, snow drifted softly outside the coffee shop windows while we sat near our usual table. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup and studied him across the room. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Adrian smiled slightly. "You usually do." I laughed. "Fair point." Then I leaned forward. "What exactly do you do?" The question clearly amused him. "I thought we already discussed that." "You said business." "That is true. That is not an answer." His smile widened. For a moment he looked genuinely entertained. "I oversee several companies." "Several?" "A few." I shook my head. "You are avoiding the question." "Perhaps." The answer made me laugh again. Yet curiosity lingered. There were small clues everywhere. Expensive watches he never mentioned. Phone calls that seemed unusually important. People occasionally recognizing him in public. Once, a restaurant manager personally greeted him before escorting us to a table despite a crowded dining room. Adrian acted as though nothing unusual had happened. I noticed everything. The strange part was that none of it changed how he treated people. He remained polite to waiters, respectful to receptionists, patient with strangers. That mattered more to me than wealth ever could. Across the city, Adrian found himself facing a problem he had never anticipated. The more time he spent with Emma Collins, the more difficult it became to maintain distance. He had intended to observe, to understand, nothing more. Yet conversations that were supposed to last 20 minutes stretched into hours. Thoughts of her followed him into meetings. Her perspective stayed with him long after their conversations ended. One afternoon David noticed it immediately. "You are smiling." Adrian looked up from his desk. "Am I?" David nodded. "More often than usual." Adrian returned his attention to the documents in front of him. Yet even he could not completely deny the observation. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. My aunt's health improved steadily. The hospital programs remained successful. Patients I cared about were receiving help they desperately needed. Everything seemed to be improving. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who was Adrian Romano really? One snowy evening as we walked together through Bryant Park, I finally voiced the thought that had been growing for weeks. Sometimes I feel like everyone knows something about you that I do not. Adrian slowed slightly. The city lights reflected across the snow-covered pathways around us. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Thoughtful. Serious. Almost conflicted. "Maybe one day," he said quietly, "I will tell you everything." His answer should have satisfied me. Somehow it only made me more curious. And as we continued walking beneath the lights of Manhattan, neither of us realized how quickly that day was approaching. The hardest moments are not the ones that arrive without warning. They are the ones that threaten something you spent years building. February arrived with freezing temperatures and gray skies hanging over Manhattan. At the hospital, everyone seemed more tired than usual. Flu cases were increasing. Resources were stretched. Staff members worked longer hours. Yet despite the pressure, our patient assistance program continued helping hundreds of people every month. It had become one of the most important parts of the hospital's community outreach efforts. That was why the announcement felt so devastating. The meeting took place on a Monday morning. Administrators, department heads, and staff members filled a conference room that suddenly felt much too small. I sat near the back beside Margaret. The atmosphere was tense from the moment we arrived. Then the hospital director delivered the news. Funding shortages, budget restructuring, program reductions. Several initiatives would be suspended indefinitely. Among them was the patient assistance program I had spent years helping develop. For several seconds nobody spoke. The words seemed impossible to process. Patients depended on that program. Families depended on it. Some people received medications, transportation, and critical support because of it. Losing it would affect hundreds of lives. Questions filled the room immediately. Administrators tried to explain. The numbers were clear. The budget gap was significant. No immediate solution existed. By the time the meeting ended, the entire hospital felt different. Conversations were quieter. Faces looked heavier. Hope suddenly felt fragile. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I continued helping patients because they still needed care. Yet every interaction carried a new weight. Each person reminded me why the program mattered. That evening, I found myself sitting across from Adrian at the coffee shop. He noticed something was wrong before I said a single word. "You look exhausted," he said gently. I laughed without humor. "That obvious?" His expression remained calm. "Talk to me." So I did. I told him everything. The funding cuts. The uncertainty. The patients who would lose support. The fear spreading through the hospital. For nearly 20 minutes I spoke while he listened. When I finished, silence settled between us. Adrian looked out the window briefly before turning back toward me. "How many people could be affected?" he asked. "Potentially hundreds." His jaw tightened slightly. It was a small reaction, but I noticed it. "And there is no alternative funding source?" "Not one anyone knows about." Adrian nodded slowly, thoughtful, focused, almost as though he were already analyzing possibilities. "You care about this very much." I stared down at my coffee. "Because it matters." My voice softened. "Some people think programs are numbers on a spreadsheet. They are not. They are real people." Adrian never looked away. "I know." The sincerity in his answer surprised me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that caught me off guard. "If you had the power to change it, what would you do?" The answer came immediately. "Save the program." His eyes held mine for several seconds. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Determination. Concern. Maybe both. Eventually he smiled slightly. "That sounds like something you would say." Later that night, after we parted ways, I walked home through cold city streets wondering what would happen next. Across Manhattan, Adrian Romano sat alone in a private office overlooking the skyline. A stack of financial reports rested on his desk. One phone call connected him to senior executives. Another connected him to foundation directors. By midnight, conversations were already underway. And for the first time since the crisis began, a solution was quietly beginning to take shape. The truth does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it enters a room and changes everything before anyone has time to prepare. 2 weeks after the funding crisis was announced, the atmosphere at the hospital shifted dramatically. Rumors began circulating through hallways and break rooms. Meetings were suddenly being scheduled. Administrators who had looked defeated now seemed cautiously optimistic. Nobody knew exactly why. Nobody had any real answers. Even Margaret admitted she was confused. "Something is happening," she told me one morning while organizing volunteer schedules. "I just do not know what." Neither did I. All I knew was that people who had been worried for weeks were beginning to smile again. Then came the announcement. The hospital auditorium filled with staff members, volunteers, and department leaders. Every seat was occupied. I sat near the middle, expecting another update about budget reductions. Instead, the hospital director stepped onto the stage wearing an expression I had not seen in months. Hope. Real hope. After thanking everyone for their patience, he shared the news. A major partnership had been finalized. Long-term funding had been secured. The patient assistance program would not only survive but expand. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then applause erupted everywhere. Some people laughed. Others cried. I felt my eyes fill with tears almost immediately. Years of work. Hundreds of patients. Countless families. Everything we had built would continue. Relief swept through the auditorium like a wave. Yet one detail immediately caught my attention. The director thanked a new strategic partner for making the agreement possible. Romano Group. The name hit me like a lightning strike.
Romano.
My heart skipped a beat. Surely not. The presentation continued. Executives from Romano Group would be attending a formal partnership ceremony later that week. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that it was a coincidence. It failed completely. 3 days later, the ceremony took place in the hospital's main conference center. Staff members gathered throughout the room. Media representatives arrived. Community leaders attended. The event felt far larger than anything our hospital normally hosted. I stood near the back speaking with coworkers when movement near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Several executives entered first. Then the room grew noticeably quieter. A familiar figure followed them.
Adrian Romano.
For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He moved through the room with calm confidence while administrators greeted him with extraordinary respect. The hospital director personally welcomed him. Board members shook his hand. Reporters immediately turned their cameras toward him. Around me people whispered. I barely heard any of it. Because suddenly every unanswered question from the past few months had found an answer. The restaurants. The recognition. The private calls. The influence. The mystery. It all made sense now. Adrian's eyes eventually found mine across the crowded room. For the briefest moment everything else disappeared. He looked almost apologetic. As though he knew exactly what I was thinking. Later, after the ceremony ended, we finally found a quiet corner away from reporters and executives. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I laughed softly in disbelief. You own Romano Group. Adrian released a slow breath. Yes. The simple answer somehow carried the weight of 100 conversations. I shook my head. You never told me. I know. His voice was calm but sincere. I wanted to. I looked at him carefully. For the first time I saw the full picture. Not just the businessman. Not just the mystery. The man. Himself. And standing there beneath the lights of the hospital I loved, surrounded by the program he had just saved, I realized that the truth I had been searching for was finally standing directly in front of me. What I did not yet know was that an even more important truth remained hidden. The reason he noticed me in the first place. The moments that define our lives often begin so quietly that we do not recognize them until much later. A week after the hospital partnership ceremony, Adrian asked if I would meet him on a Saturday afternoon. He did not tell me where we were going. He only said it was important. Under normal circumstances I might have hesitated. But by then, trust had already taken root between us. So I agreed. The city was beginning to emerge from winter. The air felt softer. Sunlight reflected from buildings that had spent months hidden behind gray skies. Adrian drove through familiar streets before eventually stopping near a place I immediately recognized. For several seconds I simply stared through the windshield. The blood donation center. The same building. The same entrance. The same sidewalk. Even the metal bench remained exactly where I remembered it. I turned toward him, confused. Why are we here? Adrian looked out the window before answering. His expression was thoughtful. Almost vulnerable. It was a side of him I rarely saw. Because this is where everything started. My heart skipped slightly. We stepped out of the car and walked toward the bench. The afternoon was quiet. People entered and exited the building carrying appointment cards and paperwork. Life continued exactly as it had months earlier. Adrian stopped beside the bench and looked at it for several moments. Then he smiled. You were sitting right there. I followed his gaze. The day I donated blood? He nodded. Yes. Suddenly pieces began falling into place. Small details. Strange coincidences. Questions that had never fully made sense. Adrian took a slow breath before continuing. I was leaving a meeting nearby that afternoon. My car stopped at the traffic light across the street. His eyes remained fixed on the bench. I saw a young woman leave the donation center looking exhausted. I listened quietly. Then I watched her help an elderly woman with groceries even though she could barely stand herself. He laughed softly. Most people would have gone home. I smiled. I probably should have. Maybe. His expression grew serious again. But you did not. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that allows truth to arrive. Adrian finally looked directly at me. I spent years meeting people who wanted something from me. Money, influence, opportunities, favors. His voice remained calm. Then I saw someone giving away something valuable without expecting anything in return. My eyes filled unexpectedly. He was not talking about blood. Not really. He was talking about kindness, sacrifice, character, everything that cannot be measured on a balance sheet. Adrian continued speaking. At first I was curious. He smiled slightly. Then I learned more about you. I laughed softly. You mean those mysterious reports? His smile widened. Among other things. For the first time, neither of us tried to avoid the truth. Everything stood clearly between us. The coffee shop conversations. The support that appeared when people needed it most. The hospital partnership. The questions. The answers. All of it traced back to one ordinary afternoon. I sat down on the same bench and looked toward the street where his car had once been stopped. The city sounded exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. Adrian sat beside me. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then I realized something important. The greatest gift that day had not been the donation itself. It had been the reminder that kindness matters, even when nobody seems to notice. Because sometimes someone does notice. Sometimes a single act creates a ripple you never see coming. I looked at Adrian and smiled. He smiled back. And as the afternoon sunlight settled across the sidewalk, I understood that one decision made for a complete stranger had quietly changed both of our lives forever.